Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Roseman, and today we are going to begin looking at the early modern era, which is the period of 1450 CE to 1750 CE. And as a jumping off point for that, we're going to first look at the European Renaissance. Um, this is considered by most historians to be the bridge between the medieval or post-classical Western Europe to the early modern period, because we're looking at a time frame of, really depends on the historian, around 1350, 1400 to the early 1600s. So it really depends on the historian and the Western European location that we're looking at. But this follows the period after the Black Death and is a period of rebirth. So the term Renaissance itself is a French word that did not really gain popular usage until the 19th century, but it literally means rebirth. Renaissance means rebirth. And there's a number of ways that we see the rebirth of Europe, Western Europe, in this time period of around 1350 to 1600, at the beginning of this early modern era. So how exactly was Western Europe reborn? Well, in a number of ways. For one, it was a revival of the interest in learning and arts, and there was a major prompt for this, and this was the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman philosophy and achievements that occurred during the post-classical era for Western Europe. So it's a rebirth in the interest of classical learning and values. There's a new outlook on life, more so that man was the center of all things, and that was expressed through the arts and literature. There's a Greek philosopher who had made the quote of, "Man is the measure of all things," and the European Renaissance truly embraced that. So where did this exactly begin? This began in a very fitting place for Western Europe, and that was in northern Italy, the northern Italian city-states, especially city-states like Florence. Florence is considered the home of the European Renaissance. But it does not stay in Italy. It winds up spreading northwards across most of Western Europe over time by the early 1600s. So why Italy? We've looked at how northern Italian city-states like Venice and Florence and Genoa began growing during the later post-classical era. But there was a lot of wealth that was flowing around northern Italy, primarily because of their trade relationships through the Mediterranean with the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire. So if you recall, during the post-classical era, we saw several major events that brought northern Italian city-states in greater contact with those areas of the world, the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire. For one, the Crusades, 1095 to 1291. Not only were Western Europeans attempting to reconquer the Holy Land from Muslims, but it also helped jumpstart long-distance trade once again with Asia through Muslim merchants and these Italian merchants. We also saw regular contact with this booming Byzantine trade, but also with Islamic Spain. So wealth flooded into to northern Italy as well. However, whenever the Byzantine Empire began to fall due to expansion through the Ottoman Turks, a lot of Greek scholars, remember the Byzantines helped preserve a lot of Greek knowledge, as did the Arabs. A lot of those Greek scholars from the Byzantines fled to Italy, escaping the Ottomans conquering Constantinople by around 1453. So with those different aspects, we see a flood of newer ideas, new in quotes, because they're really classical Greek ideas that had come from that classical period. Basically, northern Italy was reintroduced to a lot of things that they had generally forgotten during that post-classical era after the fall of the Roman Empire. Let's also not forget the Mongols, the impact that the Mongols had on trade growth and the wealth that flooded into to northern Italy from that as well. So a lot of families became very wealthy from this merchant activity. We talked about in the post-classical era how there was a rising need for banks and banking. So some northern Italian families, like Florence's Medici family, very famous, very prosperous family of northern Italy, They wanted to flaunt their wealth. They wanted to demonstrate how much they had achieved through guild operations and banking. And so the arts became a way in which they could demonstrate their wealth and power. So in this way, not only did the Medici family of Florence, this wealthy banking family, but also the Catholic Church through the leadership of the Pope, they served as patrons of the arts, funding people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, not exactly. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are named for the Renaissance, of some of the famous Renaissance artists of Italy, if you didn't know that already. Anyhow, they wind up supporting this regrowth in the arts and in the artists taking the inspiration from these Greek classical artists as well. So the Renaissance is reconnecting to that long-lost inspiration from the Greeks and Romans. Basically, this is stuff that was in their back door or backyard, but they had forgotten about. But that Greek and Roman society also served as a new model for a very materialistic society. All right. So with that, we're going to look at some of the characteristics of this European Renaissance. I'm going to run through some of these rather quickly, and we'll spend a little bit more time on others. So for example, in northern Italy, and eventually throughout much of Western Europe by around 1600, towards the close of this Renaissance period, we see an emphasis on humanism, on individualism, the idea that we can achieve as individuals, a questioning attitude or a society based on inquiry, which is going to help set the foundations for things like the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and in general help to strengthen the already existing European global exploration by the 1400s. All right. So this idea of what's out there, what don't we understand, and how can we come to understand it better, not just through religion. So the Renaissance also wound up emphasizing a very much secular society, a very secular outlook or non-religious outlook on the world. However, understand that the church, the Catholic Church, the church in general, is not going to be forgotten. It's just that the Renaissance has a new mindset that we can look beyond just the answers that the Bible offers to us. We can achieve on our own, all right, and understand on our own. There's also a growing middle class. It's not huge, but in cities that are growing because of expanding global market, especially by the early modern era, as European powers like Portugal and Spain go out and explore the world, there's going to be a lot more disposable income, money that people can spend on things beyond just their necessities. There's also greater achievements in the arts, as I've mentioned before, under Italian artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, Michelangelo, Donatello. So again, these new ways of thinking are going to set the foundations for very rapid changes in the way that Western Europeans think about themselves and their place in the world. That first item in this list here of characteristics of the Renaissance, humanism, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, as it really encapsulates this idea of the Renaissance. So humanism basically is the idea that to be human is something to celebrate. Again, to be human is something to celebrate, not look down on or be shameful of, which is generally the view of people in post-classical Western Europe. That traditional view that to be human is to be tainted with sin, and that worldly life is less important than a heavenly afterlife. So again, it's not that people aren't going to be religious. People are religious under the Christian church. However, there's a new outlook. All right, so humanism is a perspective on the world that is focused on human achievements and human potential rather than just religion and spirituality. So there's a greater secular attitude. And if you remember back to the Greek philosophers, they also, many of them embrace that idea that maybe there aren't even the gods out there. Maybe there's something else that can explain how our universe works. So that inspires this inquisitive attitude that the Renaissance embraces. So there's a concentration on everyday human problems and relationships. Basically, we can think of it as what's most important are human actions, human decisions, and human creations. The human as the center again. To be human is something to celebrate. One way that we see this embracement of humanism is through one particular Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. And I'm sure you've heard of this guy before. He's the guy that painted the Mona Lisa and one of the thousands of examples of the Last Supper from the Renaissance, a very popular subject in Renaissance paintings. But you might not know as much about his other side of life. He was very much focused on nature, science, anatomy. He was an engineer. He drew up plans for an early tank, parachutes, flying machines. He also dissected people in order to better understand how they work so that he could create even more accurate depictions of them in his art. So Leonardo da Vinci is a guy that embraces this inquisitive nature, this Renaissance man, not skilled in just one area of life, but many. So this humanist idea, it starts in Italy, as shown by people like Leonardo da Vinci in the 1400s, and it gradually spreads northward through much of Europe. And there's certain technologies that are going to speed up that process by which these Renaissance ideas spread. So what we see happening with this Renaissance is that in the long term, the Renaissance results in challenging the authority of a lot of post-classical medieval Western European ideas and institutions like the Catholic Church. In general, during this period, we see religion in decline as a central focus of interest in almost all areas of life. By the early 1500s, we're going to see some open criticism, a lot of open criticism of the Catholic Church and how it operates when we get to the Protestant Reformation. We also see challenging of the feudal system. We see a general strengthening of monarchs' powers, but also alternatives to a really strict manorial lifestyle, where the city is open to lots of new opportunities for people, including peasants. But we also see an attack on superstitions and assumptions about the natural world. Things that, if we recall again, the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were generally challenging as well during that classical period. And so we see open arms to those ideas as well here in this Renaissance. So who expressed these Renaissance ideas? Just about anybody. Artists, writers, scientists, they're embracing this inquisitive attitude and this desire to express human emotions and feelings. We see it in people like Michelangelo, the Italian painter who painted the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and a major sculptor of works like David, Leonardo da Vinci with the Mona Lisa, political scientists like Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was very much in favor of strong-armed governments, increasing the power of monarchs over their people to make those states successful. We also see it in people like Johann Gutenberg, who's going to accept that technology that originally came from East Asia via the Mongols, the printing press. We see it in people like Desiderius Erasmus, who was a religious humanist who challenged some of the basic ideas of the Catholic Church. And even William Shakespeare, playwright and poet, expressing a lot of humanistic ideals in his writings. So what allowed for these Italian Renaissance ideas to spread? The most important thing, besides trade relationships growing throughout cities in Western Europe, was the introduction and improvement on the printing press. The German engineer, this Johannes Gutenberg, made vast improvements to the speed and efficiency of the movable type printing press that had been first developed in East Asia, either by Korea or China, and then spread across Eurasia in the 1300s by the Mongols, and then eventually being accepted in Western Europe, being introduced to Western Europe by the early 1400s. But through the printing press, no longer are books going to be handwritten necessarily. All right. Instead, now we can increase the amount of printed materials, and not just books, but um, newspapers, what are called broadsides, posters, informational documents, but also music and art could be printed as well. So with that, we have an increase in the amount of printed material. And over time, you can see this in this graph, from the 1400s, whenever the printing press was first introduced, to the 1700s, the 18th century, we see a massive increase in the number of published printed books. And with that, we see the spread of these humanist ideas, some of which, many of which, are challenging the old ways of thinking. And we get a major breakthrough in an information revolution. So long before the internet, before our constant access to published materials, all right, the printing press did that for early modern Western Europe. So the Renaissance is able to have a major impact throughout Western Europe, not just northern Italy, but throughout Western Europe, spreading to France and German states, the Netherlands, England, Scandinavia. And wherever the printed word goes, those ideas spread faster. And we will see how the Renaissance is going to lay the foundations for more rapid changes in the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, and challenging the authority of previously accepted traditions.